Shadows in the Sunshine subdivision. The sun hung low over the perfectly manicured lawns of the Silver Pines Estates, a gated community that prided itself on its impeccable order. Every shrub was trimmed to regulation height, every car washed to a mirror shine, and every homeowner understood one thing: the HOA ruled all. At the center of that tiny kingdom was Mrs. Judith Carmichael, the self-proclaimed Queen of Silver Pines and the undisputed tyrant of the HOA. Judith wasn't just the president of the Homeowners Association. She was its heart, mind, and iron fist. With her clipboard always at the ready and her phone constantly in hand to document the tiniest infraction, she took her duty with a level of seriousness most people reserve for national security. Whether it was the length of grass blades, the color of seasonal wreaths, or the width of approved lawn furniture, Judith was the final authority. I'd lived in Silver Pines for 6 years, long enough to learn the unspoken rules. Don't attract attention. Don't challenge the HOA. And above all, don't cross Judith. I had managed to stay under her radar for most of that time. Until the afternoon my daughter almost died. My daughter, Lily, was 7 years old. A whirlwind of mismatched socks, glitter-smeared art projects, and the brightest smile you'd ever seen. She was my world. We had moved to Silver Pines in search of a better life, safe streets, good schools, and a community that would feel like home. It was pretty on paper, but the reality was something else entirely. That afternoon started like any other. Lily was sprawled on the living room rug, carefully arranging a tea party for her stuffed animals, while I chopped vegetables for dinner. The windows were open, a soft breeze rustling the curtains, and for a brief moment, life felt peaceful. Then the first cough came. It was soft, barely enough to catch my attention, but it didn't stop. Another, and then another, and soon Lily was clutching her throat with wide, terrified eyes. "Mommy." Her voice was thin, strained. I dropped the knife, my heart instantly racing. She was allergic to peanuts. We'd known that for years, but I had been so careful. There were no nuts in the house. None. Her breathing turned to gasps, her skin paling, lips slowly tinged with blue. Panic seized me. I fumbled for the EpiPen, my fingers clumsy with terror. I knelt beside her, injecting the life-saving medication into her thigh. I counted the seconds, waiting for the medicine to work its magic, but her breathing stayed ragged, uneven. This wasn't just an allergic reaction. Something else was wrong. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with trembling hands. The operator's calm voice did little to ease the storm inside me. "My daughter's struggling to breathe," I stammered. "We gave her the EpiPen. She's not improving. An ambulance is on the way," the operator assured me. "Stay with her and try to keep her calm." I hung up and clutched Lily's hand. "Hold on, baby. Help's coming." I rocked her gently, trying to soothe both of us. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the ambulance lights reflecting off the windows. They were here. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. The front of our house faced the community's main cul-de-sac, a common area owned and strictly controlled by the HOA. Access to emergency vehicles had always been a vague gray area in the community handbook, something most people assumed was a formality, never imagining it would matter. I learned the hard way that Judith Carmichael didn't leave room for common sense in her version of order. The ambulance slowed as it approached the gate to our street, only to be stopped dead by a figure standing squarely in its path. Judith herself, her arms crossed, clipboard tucked firmly under her elbow, and a frown deep enough to carve into marble. The paramedics rolled down the window, their expressions a mix of confusion and urgency. "This is private property," Judith barked before they could speak. "You can't enter without pre-authorization." "This is an emergency," the driver said, his voice tight. "We have a child in respiratory distress." Judith's lips pursed into a thin, disapproving line. "Rules are rules." I heard the exchange through my open window, disbelief freezing me for a moment. Then I was sprinting out the door, screaming. My daughter can't breathe. Let them in. Judith turned her head, face impassive. We have policies for a reason, dear. I nearly choked on my fury. Are you insane? This is life and death. She held up her clipboard like a holy relic, tapping a laminated page. All emergency vehicles must be cleared through the HOA in advance. This ambulance isn't on the approved list. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. You can't schedule emergencies. Yelling won't change the rules. The paramedics tried to reason with her, one even stepping out of the vehicle to explain the legalities. Judith's arms were still crossed, her expression smug with self-importance. No exceptions, she repeated. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. I would have dragged her out of the way myself if I thought it would help. Leslie's weak, gasping breaths echoed in my mind, louder than my own heartbeat. Every second lost was another step closer to losing her. And then Judith made her next mistake. She pulled out her phone, but not to call for help. No, she called community security. Two overweight men in HOA-branded polo shirts rolled up in an electric golf cart, their expressions equal parts boredom and confusion. They could probably handle overgrown hedges and noise complaints, but medical emergencies, not so much. What seems to be the problem? The older of the two asked, adjusting his walkie-talkie like a badge of honor. This ambulance isn't authorized. Judith snapped before I could speak. They're trying to violate HOA policies. I couldn't hold back any longer. My daughter is dying inside that house, and you're arguing about policies. The guards exchanged awkward glances, but Judith's glare snapped them back into obedience. We need to follow procedure, one muttered. I screamed, the kind of scream that comes from a place deeper than fear. The primal wail of a parent watching helplessly as bureaucracy stood between them and their dying child. That was when the paramedics snapped to. Without another word, the driver climbed back into the ambulance, threw it into gear, and drove straight through the imaginary barricade Judith had created, forcing her to stumble backward, clipboard flying. The guards scrambled to get out of the way, one nearly tripping over his own feet. Judith's shriek of outrage followed the ambulance like a curse, but I didn't care. I was already running back inside, guiding the paramedics to Lily's side. Her tiny body trembled, her breaths thin whistles. One paramedic slicked an oxygen mask over her face, while the other started checking her vitals. Outside, the HOA circus was still going strong. Judith was filming everything, shouting about lawsuits and rules, and reckless disregard for community standards. The guards stood uselessly by, unsure if they were supposed to arrest an ambulance crew. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was that my daughter was still alive. And now, finally, she had a chance. As I rode in the ambulance with her, I looked out the window. There stood Judith, arms crossed once more, her phone clutched like a weapon, her face red with impotent fury. I should have been scared. I should have worried about the HOA fines, the threats, the retaliation. But all I felt was rage, cold and clear, like a knife pressed to my spine. She wasn't getting away with this. Not this time. The aftermath, and the brewing storm. The ambulance tore through the perfectly paved streets of Silver Pines Estates, its siren a screaming insult to the artificial tranquility that HOA had worked so hard to cultivate. I sat in the back, holding Lily's hand, watching her tiny chest rise and fall under the oxygen mask. Every breath she took felt like a gift, and a ticking clock. The paramedics were calm, efficient, but their faces told the truth. We were lucky. Too lucky. The EpiPen should have helped faster. Whatever had triggered her reaction had overwhelmed her system far more aggressively than before. Had the ambulance been held up even 2 minutes longer, I would have been riding to the hospital alone, without my daughter. That thought clung to me like smoke. As we pulled onto the main road, I finally exhaled, the toxic grip of the HOA's jurisdiction falling away with every inch we left behind. Outside Silver Pines, life resumed as normal. No one cared about shrub heights or mailbox consistency. Outside those gates, people were allowed to be human, but I knew I would have to go back. At the hospital, the emergency room was a whirlwind of paperwork, questions, and quick decisions. Blood tests, IV drips, and a respiratory specialist were called in to stabilize Lily. They determined that it wasn't just a peanut allergy. Something else had triggered her reaction, possibly cross-contamination from a neighborhood kid's snack during an innocent game earlier in the day. It didn't matter what caused it, not at that moment. What mattered was she was safe. She was finally asleep when the nurse suggested I take a moment to breathe. That's when the rage returned. I stepped out into the hallway, shaking, my fingers curling into fists so tight my nails dug into my palms. Judith Carmichael's face flashed in my mind. That smug smirk, the clipboard gripped like a weapon, the way she knew my daughter was in danger and still refused to move. What kind of monster does that? I didn't just want her reprimanded. I wanted her removed. I wanted her to feel the fear I felt in those moments watching my daughter gasp for air. I grabbed my phone and opened a note app, my thumb flying across the screen. I listed everything. Every ridiculous rule, every time Judith had overstepped, every insane fine she had imposed on my family and others. I wasn't just going after her for what she did to Lily. I was going after the entire rotten system. This wasn't just about the ambulance. This was about power unchecked. The first call, to the police. I didn't hesitate. My thumb hovered over the call button, and within moments, I was speaking to a calm, professional voice. I want to report an incident of emergency obstruction, I said, voice trembling with restrained fury. A child's life was endangered because of a neighborhood HOA president. I expected some confusion, maybe even a polite brush-off. Instead, there was a pause, followed by, "Can you repeat that?" I gave the full account. Every word burned into my memory like a scar. The officer asked me to come down to the station when I was able to give a formal statement. I promised I would. But first, I needed to make another call. The second call, to my lawyer. I had never been litigious before. Lawsuits always felt like weapons for rich people or corporate giants. But that night, the law wasn't some distant concept. It was my only shield. My lawyer, Sam, picked up after the first ring. I hadn't spoken to him in over a year, not since a minor property dispute over a misplanted tree. Back then, he was mildly amused by the ridiculousness of Silver Pine's rules. Tonight, his tone was different. They blocked an ambulance. His voice sharpened, all humor stripped away. "Are you telling me they physically obstructed emergency services?" "Yes," I said, voice shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Judith Carmichael, the HOA president, stood in front of the ambulance and called community security to stop them. There was a long silence. "Okay," he said finally, his voice calm but with a deadly edge. "We're not just filing one complaint. We're going nuclear. Unmasking the HOA culture of control." Sam wasn't just a real estate lawyer. He'd been on the receiving end of HOA harassment himself in his younger years. He knew exactly how these little suburban dictatorships operated. They thrived on intimidation, isolation, and the idea that no homeowner would dare challenge them. Most people paid their fines, kept their mouths shut, and prayed they'd never become the next target. But not me. "First, we file a formal police report for obstruction of emergency services," Sam explained. "That's a criminal offense. She's looking at possible jail time." Just the thought of Judith in a county holding cell made me smile for the first time that day. "But that's just the appetizer," Sam continued. "We're also filing civil charges, obstruction, negligence, emotional distress, endangerment of a minor. And since the HOA itself doubled down and fined you for unauthorized ambulance entry, we'll be suing them for retaliatory fines and abuse of power." My stomach twisted at the thought of how far this would go. The legal fees, the time, the stress. But then I remembered Lily's purple lips, her tiny fingers clutching at nothing, her gasping breaths. This wasn't just my fight. This was every homeowner in Silver Pines who had ever been bullied into silence. "Do it," I said. The immediate fallout. Lily was stable enough by morning that I could leave her with my sister at the hospital while I drove back to Silver Pines to get clothes, her favorite stuffed bear, and my laptop. The moment I crossed back through the gates, the weight returned. The perfectly arranged streets looked like something out of a brochure, but now they felt sinister, every trimmed hedge hiding a neighbor too afraid to speak up. As I pulled into my driveway, a crisp white envelope was taped to my door. Violation notice. $5,000 fine for unAUV or the vehicle into a. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so unbelievably predictable. They were too blind to realize they had just handed me more ammunition. I didn't bother opening the envelope. I left it taped to the door, a silent middle finger to Judith and her minions. Neighbors in the shadows. Before I went inside, I noticed something. Movement behind curtains, neighbors peeking out. They were watching me, watching the fallout. Some of them were probably hoping I'd disappear quietly, tuck my tail between my legs, pay the fine, and let Judith win. Not this time. I stood in my driveway, phone in hand, and I called Sam on speakerphone, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "File it," I said. "File everything." And then I turned and waved at the watching windows. A clear message. I'm not afraid of you. The whisper network awakens. The funny thing about oppressive systems is that they only work when people feel isolated, when they believe they're the only ones being targeted. But that night, the calls started coming in. Quiet at first, then louder. Neighbors who had been fined for flowers 2 inches too tall. Families who had been cited for children's sidewalk chalk art. Elderly residents who had been threatened with lions over bird feeders. Everyone had a story. And now they had a voice. Me. By the time I went to bed that night, the HOA wasn't just facing one lawsuit. They were facing a revolution. And at the center of it all was Judith Carmichael, the queen whose crown was about to fall. Cracks in the crown. The morning after the ambulance incident, the sky over Silver Pines Estates was the same spotless blue it always was, sanitized, curated, too perfect. The world outside was indifferent to the storm brewing inside the neighborhood gates. But I knew, the moment I woke up, that nothing in Silver Pines would ever be the same. Lily was still in the hospital, her tiny hands curled around her favorite stuffed bear. Her breathing was easier now, the worst behind her, physically, at least. Emotionally, that was another story. Every time a nurse stepped into the room, she flinched, afraid they might bring more bad news. That look in her eyes fueled my resolve like gasoline on fire. Back at home, my phone was already vibrating nonstop. Sam, my lawyer, was as relentless as Judith had ever been. Only now, the HOA was finally facing someone who could fight back. "Good morning," Sam said when I answered. "Hope you got some rest, because the war officially starts today." I wasn't sure if it was excitement or caffeine that made him sound so energized, but I appreciated it. I felt like a soldier gearing up for a siege. "Let's go," I said. "The legal blitzkrieg begins." Sam didn't waste time. By the time I poured my first cup of coffee, he had already filed the formal police report against Judith Carmichael for obstruction of emergency services. That was the first shot, a criminal complaint that would force her into the ugly glare of law enforcement. But that was just the beginning. Next came the civil suit, not just against Judith, but against the entire HOA board. The claim was long, thorough, and devastating. Obstruction of emergency services, negligence leading to endangerment of a minor, intentional infliction of emotional distress, retaliatory fines, abuse of power under the guise of HOA authority. It wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a declaration of war. "Judith's going to scream bloody murder," Sam said. "But she's not the only target here. We're going after the HOA itself, their policies, their misuse of power, everything." They'd been getting away with this crap for years because no one's ever pushed back. I felt a small, dark satisfaction bloom in my chest. I was no longer just a mom fighting for her daughter's life. I was a wrecking ball, aimed straight at the rotten heart of Silver Pines Estates. The whisper network awakens. Word travels fast in any community, but in Silver Pines, it spread like wildfire. By noon, my phone was lighting up with messages, some anonymous, others from neighbors I barely knew. Stories poured in, like a dam breaking after years of pressure. One woman, Mrs. Chen, recounted how Judith had fined her $500 for putting a non-HOA-approved garden gnome on her porch, a gift from her late husband. When she tried to contest it, Judith threatened to file a lion on her home. A retired couple, the Porters, had been cited for hosting a backyard barbecue with their grandchildren because it violated the quiet enjoyment rule. Their fine, $1,200, all to keep the peace in a neighborhood where Judith decided what peace looked like. It was a pattern: intimidation, fines, and the underlying threat. If you fight, we'll make your life hell. For years, people had folded under the weight of those threats. But now they had someone standing up. And suddenly, they weren't afraid anymore. The HOA's first retaliation. I knew the HOA wouldn't sit quietly while I dismantled their kingdom. True to form, they struck back, but not with the clever precision they imagined. Instead, it was a clumsy, ham-fisted attempt to silence me. A letter appeared in my mailbox, a formal notice from the HOA board, citing me for hostile conduct and disruptive behavior that threatens the harmony of the community. They wanted to fine me another $3,000. I laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because it was so pathetically desperate. That notice went straight to Sam. His response was short and brutal. Perfect. More evidence for retaliation. The first HOA meeting after the incident. The board held an emergency meeting that evening. Normally, HOA meetings were sparsely attended. A handful of die-hard rule followers and a few unlucky souls dragged in to answer violations. This time, the room was packed. I could feel the tension the moment I walked in. Dozens of neighbors, faces tight with years of frustration finally surfacing. The board members sat at the front like a tribunal, with Judith at the center, her usual smug expression a little more brittle than usual. She didn't look at me, but I looked at her, and I smiled. The meeting opened with the usual robotic reading of minutes and agenda items, but then the floor opened for public comment. I stood immediately, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. Every eye turned to me. "My name is Rachel Whitman," I said, voice calm but carrying across the room. "Most of you already know why I'm here. 2 days ago, my daughter nearly died because this board, led by Mrs. Carmichael, decided to block an ambulance from reaching my home." There was a low murmur, not shock, because they already knew. They were just waiting for someone to say it out loud. Since then, I've been fined for unauthorized emergency vehicles and hostile conduct. Let me make something clear. I'm not hostile. I'm just done being afraid of you. Judith's lips pressed into a thin line, her knuckles white around her gavel. "I've filed a police report," I continued. "I've filed a civil lawsuit. And I've contacted the local press. They'll be running a story about this incident by the weekend." That got their attention. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Judith's face paled under her thick makeup. This HOA has spent years bullying, fining, and intimidating families in this neighborhood, all under the guise of community standards. But this isn't about standards. It's about control. I took a breath, scanning the room. And I'm not the only one who's tired of it. That was the moment the floodgates opened. The tipping point. One by one, neighbors stood. People I barely knew. People who had never dared speak up before. They told their stories. Fines for kids leaving bicycles on lawns. Citations for planting the wrong colored flowers. Threats of foreclosure over Christmas lights. Judith tried to regain control, slamming her gavel and shouting for order. But no one was listening anymore. The meeting devolved into chaos, voices rising, years of pent-up frustration spilling over into open rebellion. And in the middle of it all, Judith stood alone. The Queen's collapse. The next morning, an official notice went out. Judith Carmichael had resigned as HOA president, citing personal reasons. But the resignation didn't stop the legal train already speeding her way. The lawsuit, the criminal complaint, and the growing media attention were unstoppable now. With Judith gone, the rest of the board scrambled to distance themselves, rewriting policies and issuing carefully worded apologies. But the homeowners weren't satisfied with apologies. They wanted change. The rise of the new guard. By the end of the month, the HOA board had been dismantled, every member either resigning or voted out in a special election. New faces, real neighbors, not power-hungry tyrants, stepped in to rewrite the rulebook from the ground up. Silver Pines Estates wouldn't be perfect. No community ever was. But from now on, the people living there would have a voice. Epilogue. The woman who disappeared. As for Judith, she didn't just leave the board. She left Silver Pines altogether. Her house went up for sale within weeks, and no one saw her at any local events again. She became a cautionary tale, whispered about at block parties and book clubs. The Queen of Rules, brought down by a mother who refused to kneel. The reckoning and the cost of war. The days after Judith Carmichael's resignation were some of the quietest Silver Pines had ever experienced. It was eerie, the kind of silence that settles over a battlefield after the last cannon fires, smoke still hanging in the air, bodies left to count. But it wasn't over. Not for me, not for Lily, and definitely not for Judith. The neighborhood might have been ready to turn the page, eager to repaint fences and plant seasonal flowers, as though nothing had ever happened. But I couldn't move on. Not yet. Not while my daughter still startled awake at night, wheezing from nightmares of being unable to breathe. Not while the HOA's letterhead still hung on my refrigerator, a $5,000 fine for saving her life. The first court date. The summons had gone out. Judith had been officially charged with obstruction of emergency services, a second-degree misdemeanor, but the civil suit, that was where the real fight would happen. I didn't want a settlement. I wanted a public record, something no homeowners association, no overzealous board, no petty tyrant could sweep under the perfectly maintained astroturf. Sam was a shark in a suit, and he walked into that first hearing like a man who knew he was about to feast. Judith, on the other hand, was a shadow of herself. Gone was the woman with her iron-straight posture and clipboard held like a scepter. She sat at the defendant's table, shrinking into her stiff blazer, her hair a shade too dark to hide the panic on her face. Her lawyer, some HOA-recommended stooge, tried to argue that Judith was simply following protocol, protecting the community from unauthorized vehicles, ensuring that emergency procedures were handled in accordance with HOA policy. That was the exact moment Sam stood, face impassive, hands clasped behind his back. "Let me clarify something for the court," he said, voice calm but cutting like a scalpel. "There is no legal mechanism, in this state or any other, that allows a private citizen, even an HOA president, to obstruct emergency personnel responding to a medical crisis." The judge barely lifted his head from the papers in front of him. He's right. Judith's lawyer paled. Judith herself looked ready to faint. This wasn't going to be a legal battle, not really. This was going to be a slaughter. The evidence pile. Sam didn't just rely on my testimony, or the paramedics' reports, though those were damning enough. He went deeper. Over the next 2 weeks, he built a timeline of HOA abuse, compiling violations, fines, and complaints that went back nearly a decade. Emails from Judith, brimming with passive-aggressive threats over mailbox colors. Security footage of her pacing the entrance gate, clipboard in hand, like a guard at a prison camp. Voice messages left on neighbors' phones, lecturing them for non-regulation lawn decorations. It was a portrait of a woman drunk on power. And the best piece of evidence, the security footage from the ambulance standoff itself. A shaky clip recorded by a terrified neighbor, showing Judith physically standing in front of the ambulance, arms out, screaming about protocols while a child gasped for air just yards away. Sam played it for the court. No commentary necessary. The HOA tries to cut the rope. Judith's downfall was inevitable, but the HOA itself, the larger beast, was harder to slay. They had money, insurance, lawyers, and the institutional cowardice to throw Judith under the bus if it meant saving their own skins. The new HOA president, a timid man named Greg Cartwright, who had only taken the role after Judith's resignation left a vacuum, reached out to Sam with an offer. "If your client drops the civil suit against the HOA," Greg said, his voice trembling through the phone, "we'll erase all her fines, refund previous payments, and adopt a revised emergency access policy." Sam didn't even pause. "Double the refund, and make the policy revision permanent and legally binding." There was silence on the other end, then a defeated sigh. Deal. The media circus. I expected the local news to pick up the story. A suburban scandal with just enough outrageous detail to fill a 5-minute segment between weather updates and dog adoption stories. What I didn't expect was for it to go viral. A neighbor, one of the quiet ones who had never dared speak up before, had leaked the security footage online. It spread like wildfire. HOA horror stories were internet gold, and Judith became the national face of suburban tyranny. My phone rang off the hook. Reporters wanting interviews, advocacy groups wanting my story for their anti-HOA campaigns, even a true crime podcast asking for an exclusive. I turned down most of it. This wasn't about fame. This was about fixing what was broken. For Lily, for me, for everyone who had ever lived under the weight of someone like Judith Carmichael. The personal toll. But even as the lawsuits moved forward, and the neighborhood shifted under the weight of its own shame, my world felt smaller. Lily was healing, but the fear lingered in her eyes. She asked questions no 7-year-old should ask. Why didn't the ambulance come right away, Mommy? Did I do something wrong? I tried to explain, in ways a child could understand, that sometimes grown-ups get so obsessed with rules they forget about people. That sometimes, the people who are supposed to keep you safe are the ones you have to stand up to. She nodded, but I could see the unease in her. She wasn't too young to know that the world could turn cold, even in a neighborhood with perfect sidewalks and matching mailboxes. The settlement and the scars. Judith's personal lawsuit settled just before trial. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to cover every medical bill, every therapy session, and set aside a college fund for Lily. More than that, it was a public acknowledgement of guilt, a permanent mark on Judith's record. The HOA's reforms were locked in place, their rules rewritten under legal supervision. No HOA officer could ever again interfere with emergency services. Future boards would face automatic dissolution if they tried. It wasn't just a victory, it was a warning. The last sight of Judith. I saw her once after that, just briefly. I was driving past a gas station on the edge of town, heading back from the hospital with Lily. Judith stood at the pump, her back hunched, her hair now fully gray, her phone no longer clutched like a weapon, just dangling uselessly in her hand. She looked smaller. She looked human. For a fleeting moment, I felt something like pity. Then I remembered the sound of my daughter gasping for air, and the pity evaporated like morning fog. I drove past without slowing down. Silver Pines after the storm. The neighborhood changed after that. Some houses went up for sale. People who had been part of Judith's inner circle, too embarrassed to stay. Others stayed, hopeful for a fresh start, under the new, less oppressive HOA. Me? I stayed for Lily. Not because I loved Silver Pines, but because this was our home, and no petty tyrant would ever again make us feel like strangers inside our own walls. Lily played in the front yard again, her laughter ringing out like a bell. a sound that no rulebook could silence. And every time an ambulance passed by, siren blaring, the gates swung wide. No questions asked. The legacy of defiance. The storm had passed, or so the neighborhood wanted to believe. The Silver Pines Estates newsletter, which had once published monthly articles glorifying Judith Carmichael's devotion to preserving community standards, now made no mention of her at all. It was as if the entire neighborhood was trying to erase her existence, a collective act of suburban amnesia. But I couldn't forget, and neither could Lily. The house felt different in the months after Judith's downfall. It was quieter, yes. The constant threat of fines or reprimands no longer hung in the air like a bad smell. But there was also a heaviness, an awareness that came with knowing how fragile safety really was. Lily had changed too. She smiled, she played, but sometimes, when a delivery truck slowed outside the house, or when she saw a security cart drive by, her hand would instinctively clutch at my sleeve. Some wounds heal over, but the scar underneath always remembers. A community shaken awake. What surprised me most wasn't the relief of Judith's departure. It was the slow realization among my neighbors that we had all been complicit. For years, everyone had shrugged off the fines, the arbitrary rules, the humiliating letters taped to doors. We convinced ourselves it was just the cost of living in a nice neighborhood. It wasn't until my daughter's life hung in the balance that anyone really understood the monster we'd allowed to grow unchecked. Some of my neighbors came to apologize. Others avoided me entirely, uncomfortable with the mirror my presence held up to their own cowardice. A few, the ones who had benefited from proximity to Judith's little regime, moved away. I didn't miss them, but the vast majority. They were grateful. The new HOA board, made up of volunteers with no thirst for power, took their responsibilities seriously. The new emergency access policy was printed and distributed to every home. A mandatory annual training session for all future board members ensured they understood the legal limits of their power. But those were just policies. The real change was deeper. Neighbors stopped spying on each other, stopped filing petty complaints. Block parties that had once been whispered affairs, held in backyards, where Judith's all-seeing eyes couldn't spot unapproved decorations, became community-wide events. Without Judith's surveillance, Silver Pines began to breathe again. Lily's recovery, and her questions. Lily's physical recovery was faster than I expected, but the emotional one took longer. Some nights, I would wake to find her standing silently at my bedroom door, just watching me. "Mommy," she would whisper. "Yeah, baby. Are we safe now?" It broke me every time. I told her the truth, because she deserved it. "We're safer now, sweetie. But if anyone ever tries to hurt us again, we'll stand up to them. Together." That seemed to comfort her, at least a little. But the questions kept coming. Why did the lady block the ambulance? Why did people listen to her? Why do grown-ups care so much about rules? Some I could answer. Some I couldn't. But I promised her one thing. We'd never live under someone like Judith again. The invitation that changed everything. I thought our story would end there, with a quieter, slightly wiser neighborhood and a family learning how to trust the world again. But then the email arrived. Subject: HOA Reform Conference. Guest speaker invitation. At first, I thought it was spam. Who hosts conferences about HOAs? But the sender was the Homeowners Defense Network, a national advocacy group dedicated to protecting residents from HOA abuse. They had seen the viral video, read about our case, and wanted me to speak. Me, a suburban mom who had never given a speech in her life. I almost declined. But then I remembered Lily's questions, and the other kids, the other families, who might still be trapped in neighborhoods run by people like Judith. They deserved to know they weren't alone. I said yes, facing a larger monster. The conference was held in a modest hotel ballroom in Atlanta, a world away from the manicured perfection of Silver Pines. The attendees weren't what I expected. They weren't rebels or troublemakers. They were regular people. elderly couples, single parents, veterans, young families, all of them with stories of fines, harassment, and fear. Some had lost their homes. Some were still fighting. All of them were looking for hope. When I stood at the podium, my palms sweaty and my heart pounding, I told our story. Every raw, terrifying, humiliating detail. I told them about the fines, the ambulance blockade, the retaliation, and the day I decided not to be afraid anymore. I expected polite applause. What I got was a standing ovation. The movement begins. What I hadn't realized until that moment was that our story wasn't unique. It was happening in neighborhoods across the country, not just in wealthy suburbs, but in trailer parks, condo complexes, and rural developments where a handful of petty tyrants had built fiefdoms out of bylaws and fear. The Homeowners Defense Network asked me to become a regular speaker and advocate. They wanted me to help teach others how to fight back, legally, peacefully, but relentlessly. At first, I wasn't sure. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't an activist. I was just a mom. But maybe that was exactly what they needed. Judith's final echo. A few months after the conference, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter from Judith. It was handwritten, the letters small and careful, the tone coldly formal. There was no apology, no admission of guilt, only a bitter paragraph blaming me for destroying the community's harmony and warning me that one day I'd understand how hard it was to maintain order. There was no signature. I burned the letter over my kitchen sink and watched the ashes swirl down the drain. Judith was gone, but her shadow was a warning I would carry forever. Lily's legacy. Lily was sitting on the porch a few weeks later, coloring in one of her sketchbooks, when I noticed something in her drawing. It was a picture of a house, our house, with an ambulance in the driveway and a big red X over a stick figure holding a clipboard. "Who's that?" I asked, pointing at the stick figure. "That's the bad lady," she said, not even looking up. "But she's gone now." And under the picture, in her careful second-grade handwriting, she had written, "No more bad ladies." I hugged her so tightly she squealed. We were healing. Slowly, messily, but together. The new normal. Silver Pines changed after all of it, but so did I. I stopped avoiding my neighbors. I invited people over without worrying about who might be watching. I planted wildflowers in the front yard, ignoring the lingering stares from old-timers who still clutched their rulebooks like life rafts. And when the new HOA president, Greg, the one who took over after Judith, knocked on my door to ask my advice on drafting new community policies, I knew we had won. Not because Judith was gone, not because the rules had changed, because the fear was gone, because my daughter could breathe. And so could I. The woman they couldn't silence. The summer sun beat down over Silver Pines estates, the same manicured lawns, the same paved paths, but everything felt different. There was no more fear humming beneath the surface, no more neighbors peeking through curtains, terrified of a clipboard appearing at their door. Judith's kingdom was gone, and in its place stood something unfamiliar, a community finding its voice. But even as Silver Pines exhaled, I was still learning how to breathe again. The girl who almost died. Lily was 8 now, and there were whole days where I could almost forget. Almost. She ran through sprinklers with the other neighborhood kids, built forts out of pillows, and rode her bike in endless loops around the cul-de-sac. But sometimes, when I called her name, she hesitated, like some part of her still remembered what it felt like to have her breath stolen. There were nights when I found her curled up at the foot of my bed, too proud to ask if she could sleep with me, but too scared to sleep alone. She never said it outright, but we both knew. She didn't trust the world to keep her safe anymore. And how could she? Neither did I. The court case that made history. The civil case against Judith officially ended 6 months after her resignation, but the ripple effects carried far beyond our little neighborhood. The settlement was more than just money. It was a legal precedent. Judith's actions were classified not just as HOA overreach, but as civil negligence with willful endangerment. It was the first time a private HOA president in our state had been held personally liable for obstructing emergency services. Legal scholars, the type who normally debated corporate liability or property disputes, were suddenly talking about Silver Pines Estates. Judith's name appeared in case law, referenced in legal journals, even becoming a footnote in new legislation proposed to rein in HOA authority across multiple states. The woman who once ruled over mailbox colors and garden gnomes had become a cautionary tale. And I, the woman she once fined for leaving chalk drawings on the sidewalk, had become the face of a movement. Rachel Whitman, accidental advocate. I never set out to be anyone's hero. I was a single mom, trying to raise a daughter and keep a roof over our heads. But somewhere along the way, my story stopped being just mine. It started with the Homeowners Defense Network, the group that had first invited me to speak at their conference. They kept asking me back, not because I was a polished speaker, but because I wasn't. I didn't talk like a lawyer or an activist. I spoke like a mother who knew what it felt like to watch her child die because someone cared more about a rulebook than a life. From there, it snowballed. I gave interviews to small-town newspapers, podcasts, even local TV. I sat on panels next to attorneys, community organizers, and former HOA enforcers who had defected, all of us united by one belief: homeowners associations should serve their communities, not rule them. And people listened, because they saw themselves in me. The mom fined for planting sunflowers instead of hydrangeas. The grandfather fined for letting his grandkids' sidewalk chalk linger too long. The disabled veteran told his ramp violated aesthetic standards. Everywhere I went, people whispered their stories to me, sometimes with shame, sometimes with anger, but always with that same flicker of hope. If I could fight back and win, maybe they could too. The backlash. Of course, not everyone saw me as a hero. There were HOA hardliners, the ones who believed order was more important than freedom. They called me a troublemaker, a threat to community standards. I got hate mail, some of it anonymous, some of it signed by HOA presidents from across the country. One letter, handwritten in perfect cursive, called me a cancer in the body of American homeownership. I framed it. Because if making neighborhoods safer for kids like Lily was cancer, then I'd happily be terminal. Lily's journey. For all my speeches and lawsuits and interviews, my biggest victory was watching Lily find her voice. She was shy for a long time after the ambulance incident, afraid of attention, afraid of speaking up. But the more I talked about what happened, the more she saw me standing tall, the more she began to believe we were safe. One afternoon, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, carefully drawing a poster for her school's kindness club. At the top, in bright bubble letters, she'd written, "Rules shouldn't hurt people," and underneath she'd drawn an ambulance, with no one standing in its way. When I asked her why she made it, she just shrugged. Because I want people to know. And just like that, I realized my daughter wasn't just surviving. She was learning to fight back too. The letter from the HOA. 1 year to the day after Judith blocked the ambulance, a letter arrived from the new HOA board. For a moment, my stomach clenched. Old habits die hard. But this wasn't a fine or a violation. It was an invitation. Dear Rachel, in recognition of your courage and commitment to ensuring the safety and rights of all residents, the Silver Pines Estates HOA would like to formally invite you to join the board as a community advisor. Your voice has made our neighborhood stronger, and we hope you will help us continue building a safer, more inclusive future. Sincerely, the Silver Pines OA Board. I stared at the letter for a long time. Part of me wanted to laugh. Me? On the HOA board. The same HOA that once tried to fine me out of existence. But another part of me, the part that remembered how scared I'd been, how small they'd made me feel, knew this was the only way to make sure it never happened again. I said yes. The new Silver Pines. As an advisor, I helped rewrite the rulebook from the ground up. No fines without clear, documented violations. No anonymous complaints. No fines for children's play or seasonal decorations. And most importantly, a standing policy guaranteeing emergency vehicles unrestricted access at all times. That rule had Lily's name on it. At our first official community event after the new policies passed, Lily stood beside me at the microphone. Her voice was small but steady. "My name is Lily Whitman," she said, "and I'm happy to live here now. Because this neighborhood saved me. There wasn't a dry eye in the park. Legacy beyond the gates. I could have stopped there, let Silver Pines become the happy ending. But the fight wasn't just about my daughter anymore. Other neighborhoods, other families, were still living under their own Judiths, their own tyrants with clipboards and bylaws that cared more about grass height than human lives. So I kept speaking, kept organizing, kept showing up wherever people needed someone to say, 'You are not alone.' I wasn't the same scared mom I'd been that day, trembling with the phone in my hand, begging for help. I was the woman they couldn't silence." Final words. Silver Pines isn't perfect. No community ever is. But it's ours now, not because of a rulebook, but because we fought for it. Because we remembered that neighborhoods aren't just houses and lawns. They're people. And no rule is ever more important than a life. Epilogue. Lily, now 10, keeps a scrapbook. On the first page is the photo of her and me, standing together at the new community garden, smiling in front of a sign that reads, "Welcome to Silver Pines, where people matter most." And below it, in her own handwriting, she added, "No more bad ladies."